Um, you kind of trace this lineage really beautifully. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more, I mean, if you can, about this idea of the Atlanteans, because I think it's something that for many people seems so superficial, so woo-woo, and yet, that word comes from the Greeks. It comes from Plato,
Yeah.
from his uncle, from Solon, who said he got it from the Egyptians.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I think as more of this kind of interdisciplinary knowledge, especially even as you're mentioning this idea of translation, of having access to this information, these concepts become less crazy. There's more of a direct lineage that it can be tied to or spoken about. So I was wondering if you could share any more about Atlantis, and then you were also speaking about this idea because we were speaking of a more Western history. But if you're familiar, or anything you can speak of also about this part of the world, because that's also, if we're tracing things back to Atlantis, I mean, it's very interesting, even like the situation of it, which is between the kind of the East and the West, between Europe and the Americas, that same impulse, that same civilization, the same remnants were seated here in this land, and I think there's so many remnants of them here too, and maybe in a sense of even a more unbroken lineage, which is why you're saying so many Westerners are coming here, because there are people in the Amazon, in the Andes, who kind of, because of the isolation, weren't exposed to some of these new ideas, and so and it's not that they're pure, they're untouched, or they don't have bad ideas too, but some of those seeds or impulses remained in a way that's maybe there's a firmness, there's a tangibility that still is connected to that lineage that you were speaking about.
The thing that's coming up now on the two things that you brought up, like on like the first thing about being orphans, and also sharing more about Atlantis, is the unavoidable theme of black magic. Because what's happening to Westerners now is actually a very deliberate soul capture thing that's happening. It's very evil. Is that if you cut people off from their roots, you can capture their soul. If people don't know who they are, they can be captured and indoctrinated and enslaved. So there is an actual macrocosmic conspiracy to capture souls that is happening in the world, and a prerequisite for that is cutting us off from our origins, from knowledge of who we are, knowledge of where we come from, knowledge of our ancestors, knowledge of any higher spiritual values, and then corrupting whatever spiritual guidance we're supposed to have. Like if you can corrupt Christianity, then people can't find any safety or protection in Christianity, and you give them this fake alternative, which is scientific materialism, which leads to atheism, which allows the soul to be captured. You can do whatever you want. There's no soul, there's no eternal soul, there's no karma, there's no reincarnation. You can do whatever you want. You don't need to tell the truth. You can screw people over just for your own gain. And this is a kind of...
because there is no truth.
Because there is no truth, or truth is permanently relative. There's no... and so that leads to a kind of ripeness for souls to be captured. And that's what's happening. We're living in a time where there really is like harvesting of souls, capturing of souls, enslavement of souls, and very deliberate use of trauma to do black magic. And this gets back to the other question of Atlantis.
And that I think will bridge into the next question, because I'd love to get more into that. Okay. Because that's actually something I feel quite strongly and see more and more too. But yeah.
So Atlantis fell because of black magic. Because the leaders, the spiritual leaders of Atlantis, first of all, Atlantis was a global civilization. Yes, I think that there was an actual, like the capital of it was in the middle of the Atlantic, and where there's currently the mid-Atlantic ridge. If you look at the relief of the ocean floor, you see like stitches. Like if you look at the relief of the Atlantic floor, there's a rift right down the middle, and it looks like the earth opened up, swallowed something, and then got like stitched up. It almost seems like there's like a stitches down the middle of the Atlantic floor. Rudolf Steiner says that, yeah, actually there was a continent that sank through like immense volcanic activity. Like literally, and it didn't take place like in one night. It took place over thousands. It took place over a long period of time. Like the flooding of Atlantis was not just like overnight thing. Timelines get distorted in the Bible, like when they say 40 days. That does not mean literally 40 days, you know. But at a certain point, because there are spiritual beings that exist in the spiritual world. There are good ones and there are evil ones. So there exist actually evil divine beings. And we have a name in Western civilization for one particular evil divine being. We call him Satan. Rudolf Steiner gave a new name to this being. He used the Zoroastrian cosmology and called him Ahriman. Ahriman. Ahriman is the spirit that inspired the Roman Empire to like take over the world, and then inspired the emperors to take over Christianity, and then inspired the Inquisition, and then inspired the genocide of the shamanic impulse. So in order to understand occult history, it's necessary to understand that there are actually higher beings that are very, very old, that are like emanations of the Creator that at a certain point rebelled and fell. And so we need to have a sort of cosmology as a starting point to understand history, that humanity is being influenced by divine beings, both good divine beings and evil, fallen divine beings. And at a certain point, the initiates of Atlantis, the leaders, because Atlantis was led by semi-divine humans, humans that had been getting initiated in the Atlantean mysteries. And in those times when you were initiated into the Atlantean mysteries, there was less limits on the power that a human could have. So the human initiates back then were semi-divine, and they stood so far above the people that they were ruling. They were like looked up to as gods amongst men, and they reference that in the Bible when they talk about these god men that were the offspring of the gods or the giants, like impregnating the earthly women, and they gave rise to the men of renown. They're called in the Bible the men of renown. These are the leaders of Atlantis that were just standing so far above the people they were leading. And this figure that I call Ahriman, this great adversary, this great evil god, he started to corrupt the Atlantean mysteries themselves. He went right to the top and started to corrupt the leaders. And he taught the leaders black magic. And so you have this kind of corruption of the leadership of the global civilization. It was a global civilization. So there was outposts everywhere. There was everywhere, like here in Peru, in Sacsayhuaman, in Ollantaytambo, you see that there was obviously a spiritual center here. But then you go to the Great Pyramids of Giza, and you see the same stonework, the exact same stonework. So there was like outposts all over the world. So I believe that there was like a central continent where like the capital of this global civilization was like in the middle of the Atlantic. But it was a global civilization. And so we're here in one of the spiritual centers of this advanced civilization here in Peru. You have others in Egypt, and you have various others around the world. So the leadership got corrupted by an evil god and was learned black magic, and then you have the entrance of like the abominations, like how to use, I don't even want to get into too many details, it's even difficult to talk about. But when the leadership got corrupted, that's when the civilization needed to be destroyed. So you have remember I was talking about this figure of Manu? He's represents in the storyline, he's like the initiate who stayed faithful, who didn't get corrupted. And so he was guided to like rescue the knowledge and plant it in a new world, and he was given the knowledge that the civilization would need to be destroyed. But we are now living, right now, in a recapitulation of what happened then. We're now living in what more and more is a global civilization, where the leaders have been corrupted by black magic, and they now completely embrace it. And it's like their modus operandi is black magic. And so, back then, the Manu figure was guided to the Himalayas, and he took all of his students, let's say, like the holy rishis and the earlier incarnations of Zarathustra and Hermes Trismegistus, and all these civilizational founders. Right? So this idea, this theme it repeats itself, where like the bodhisattvas and the preservers of human history and the preservers of human spiritual knowledge, they get guided to a refuge as the world is being prepared to be cleansed through catastrophe. They get guided to like the mountains, and they kind of how do you say, consolidate all the knowledge in the mountains, while a catastrophe comes and like wipes the slate clean, and then the seeds for the next cycle come from the mountains and like repopulate the earth, or replant the seeds of civilization. Because all the civilizations start from initiates. Civilizations are not started by a bunch of farmers. Civilizations are started by spiritual leaders that are illuminated and that have this knowledge of the mysteries. That's the kind of seed of all these civilizations. So I think that here in Peru is a very powerful place to be right now, because I think that in the past cycle, the Himalayas was where the spiritual knowledge was preserved. I think in this cycle, the spiritual knowledge is being preserved in the Andes. And so a lot of people that have this bodhisattvic calling to serve and be like, warriors for humanity's spiritual evolution, and protectors and preservers and consolidators and evolutionizers, they're all kind of finding this mysterious calling to the Andes, and they're just kind of coming here from all over the world. They're coming here because I think that there's this bodhisattvic impulse that's happening here, and something special is happening in the Andes, because we're at this kind of recapitulation of like what happened with Atlantis. The leadership has become totally corrupted by black magic, and the catastrophes are necessary. It's a global shamanic initiation. So remember I said in Europe, like with the Dark Ages, with like the really dark medieval period where there was like the Black Plague, and the Roman Church was so evil, and it was genociding all of the spiritual impulses. And that was like this demonic dismemberment before the Renaissance. That was like a cultural epoch of like a shamanic initiation. These are global shamanic initiations where like the whole global civilization is being dismembered, and then there's like a shamanic rebirth that's being planned. So I feel that the people that find their way here are unconsciously, or in some cases consciously, being guided to this global shamanic initiation that's happening.